and walking away from addiction. Praise the Lord. I think that one of the sad realities of especially our third world is the either inability or refusal to acknowledge trauma, not to talk of process and deal with trauma. In Africa, especially, if you deal with stuff, what you get is it has happened now, just forget it. So that's such an unrealistic way to deal with terrible experiences, but that's our reality. So, what is trauma? What is trauma? I like to define trauma as any psychological, emotional, or physical response to an event or series of events that are deeply, deeply, deeply distressing or disturbing. These events can overwhelm an individual's ability to cope with life. The events can cause feelings of helplessness and significantly affect their sense of self, safety, and well-being. So, long and short of the plenty English is that trauma is anything that affects a person so deeply that the person needs to find coping mechanism for it. The person needs to find a way to cope. Let me underscore that with a story of a little boy whom I was sitting in my house outside, and I saw a boy walking past. My fence is open, so you can see when people are passing. And the boy couldn't have been more than 11, 12, 13 max. And he was smoking a cigarette. So I ran from where I was sitting to the gate and I called him, "Hey, oh boy, come. I beg, no see me for this kind of house till say I get money. I beg, you don't reach 2 days now, I never see money buy cigar. I beg, give me that your cigar, make I puff small, I go give you back." So he looked at me and he smiled a very kind of shy smile and he hid the cigarette behind his back and he said, "Auntie, I know saying I play, you they play. Oh, I know you are joking." And I'm like, "Why are you smoking? You are a child." And this is what came out of his mouth. He said, "Auntie, I did smoke to forget my sorrow. I did smoke to forget my pain." I said, "What is sorrowifying you? Is there in English like that? What is sorrowifying you?" And he said, "My parents died when I was about 5 years old, both of them. And I was left alone. So I was living on the streets. And somebody saw me and picked me up and brought me from Aba, where I used to live, and brought me to Port Harcourt. But then the person himself died or disappeared. I don't know what happened to that person. And then he was left alone again at age 10, 11. He said, "I live in an uncompleted building and all I do is I look for building sites and I go there to either carry blocks on my head or carry sand in headpans so they can give me 2,000 to 3,000 naira every day, and then that's what I use to eat." He said, "Auntie, when I'm smoking, temporarily I forget. When I'm smoking, it takes my mind off of what my reality is." I said, "Until the stick of cigarette finishes, right?" And he looked at me and he walked away, And that's exactly how many of us function. We find coping mechanisms that last only as long as the exercise does. If it's a bottle of alcohol, we drink, and when the effect passes, we're left staring at the same problem. If it is sex we're using, when the euphoria of a sexual release happens and ends, we are faced with the same challenges. If it is anger we are using, whatever it is we're using, what happens is that every time we indulge, we forget, but it's just for a brief time, and then we're right back where we were. So coping mechanisms are good for a moment. It's like denial, good for the moment, but after then they're no longer useful. In fact, they become harmful. Denial is a friend of mine whose husband left for work in the morning and says, "See you in the evening." And 2 hours later, there was a knock on the door. She opens the door and it was policemen standing there. And they said, "We're so sorry to tell you, your husband just died." And she started laughing. She just started laughing at the police people. First of all, the fact that police were at the door should underscore the seriousness of the situation. But Denial at that time served the purpose of helping her absorb the shock of what she was hearing. But after 2 days, if you are still laughing, then we have to go to the psychiatrist, because now that coping mechanism has become a problem. You are denying to the point of excluding reality. So trauma is all of us. Trauma is everyone. There's no one on this platform tonight listening that has not experienced trauma in various forms. So let me just say to you the ways that trauma can come. Okay, trauma can come from acute events, that is things like a sexual assault, like a rape, like a car accident and you're breaking bones, or just the terror of watching the accident happen and being in a car that is some assaulting, or a sudden loss. This is acute. It happened momentarily, but it had a profound effect on you. Then we have chronic experiences. Trauma can come from chronic experiences like ongoing abuse. Some of us grew up in the most horrifying abusive situations that we may not even be able to talk about. So when it's spread over time, like growing up with an alcoholic father, which was me, okay, every night he went and drank and came back, we were traumatized. We were worried when he wasn't there, and more worried when he was there, when he was drunk. All right. And then you also have neglect. You have things like racism, poverty, discrimination. And then you have developmental factors also, like adverse childhood experiences. So you can see that if I say every one of us on this platform has known trauma, you know that I'm right, just by looking at this: acute, chronic, and developmental factors. These are places that trauma can result from. There are different types of trauma. There's physical trauma, like injury or harm to the body, like in April, I went to preach on the 29th of April in Lagos. Returned on the 30th of April. Got to Port Harcourt from Lagos. Came down from the plane and was walking to arrivals to pick up my luggage. How I fell down is what we can't explain till today. On the flat tarmac. I wasn't wearing heels. There was no rough ground. It was just flat tarmac, and I fell and I broke my foot. My God. When they raised me from the ground, the pain reached my oblongata, medulla oblongata. We got home that day, and to my shock, the night before I was strutting on high heels on the pulpit ministering, and by the next evening my leg was in a cast. The pain is unbelievable. So that's a physical trauma, and they gave me some wickedly powerful painkillers. Now, what do painkillers do? They suppress the pain signals to the brain, and they give you this relief. And because you are looking for the relief, you see, the pain is a trauma, and in trauma we're looking for how to relieve the pain, so we look for medication. All right, they gave me some strong medications. The danger is that after a while we get hooked on the relief that the medication gives to us, even when the pain is gone. So it's a symbiotic thing going on in the brain at that time. So that's physical trauma. There is emotional and psychological trauma, which is lasting mental and emotional effects from distressing experiences. Lasting mental and emotional effects from distressing experiences. Then we have what is called complex trauma. From the name, you can tell it's exposure to multiple traumatic events over time, often within relationships like childhood abuse or being married to an abusive spouse. Complex trauma. So inside the abuse that you're experiencing, you could have physical injury. Inside of that, you could lose a loved one suddenly. So that's a mix, is a potpourri or cauldron of all kinds of painful experiences happening at the same time. So each one comes with its type of pain and demand for a coping mechanism. Then you have intergenerational trauma. And many of us are exposed to this. What is intergenerational trauma? Is trauma that is passed down through families or cultures, often linked to systemic oppression or war. For example, female genital mutilation. Hello. All right. And one time I had an issue with my husband and I left. And he came to get me, and we had to drive through Benin to get back to Port Harcourt. I left for the north, which was my comfort zone, is where I'm from, and he followed me to pick me and bring me back. And we passed through Mama's house, his mom. And when Mama heard the details of what was happening, what Mama said to me was, my pikin, now woman life be that now, my pikin, you know, go vex like that, they go. I said, Mama, stop. That was an attempt to perpetuate the generational trauma of sitting down with abuse and calling it now woman life. I said, Mama, stop. Your generation had no options. Mine does, and I will take the options. Mama looked at me in shock. She could not comprehend what I was saying. You understand? But generational trauma is also me finding myself becoming just like my mother, whom I vowed never to be like when I was growing up, and watching her suffer abuse at my father's hand. And my mental thoughts were, I will never let a man do that to me. How I fell into that pattern is what I cannot explain to you. But I found myself repeating my mother's life, taking abuse that was inhuman. So intergenerational trauma is passed down through families or through cultures. All right? Now, let's go to the key characteristics of trauma. One, trauma is subjective. What does that mean? Two people can go through the same experience, but one may be traumatized and the other is not. I'll give you a funny example, even though it's tragic, okay? My immediate younger sister and I started smoking on the same day. Yes, Reverend Christie smoked cigarettes, okay? Nothing more than cigarettes. I didn't smoke any other thing, just cigarette. But that smoking, two of us, we found a half-smoked cigarette. I was about 9 years old, and my sister was about 7 years old. By this time, we're already drinking alcohol, plenty alcohol, but cigar we have not tried. But we used to see them on TV, you know, every time they had a glass of wine or alcohol or something, and they had a cigarette on the other hand, and they'll do that, and the glass is there with the drink, and they look so glamorous, just holding. We wanted to try it. So we found a half-smoked cigarette. Chai, God delivered us hepatitis. On this half-smoked cigarette, we picked it up and carried my mother's matches from the kitchen, ran under the staircase of our estate. We were living in an estate then, so there were about 6 flats in the huge, massive complex. Under the staircase, we went and hid there, and then we lit the cigarette. Now, because I was the older one, let me start. Maureen says, I smoked paper and powder. Wonderful. I didn't smoke powder, but I smoked paper, definitely. But this one was a real cigarette. So we lit the cigarette, and because I was the older one, I took a puff. I dragged on it like we used to see on TV. But when I came back to puff out, mine was glamorous, not at all. I puffed out coughing. I coughed and coughed and coughed and coughed until I crashed on the ground. Crashed on the ground. Tears were coming out of my eyes. My sister was like, you don't try your own, even though you did cough, I try my own. And my sister took it, dragged on it, puffed out nothing, took it, dragged. She finished that half cigarette and nothing happened to her. No trauma, no reaction. But guess what? My sister died from complications of smoking when she was 4. But she started when she was 7. Do you see that? So trauma is subjective. 2 people, 3 people, 5 people can be exposed to the same experiences. One will be traumatized and the other is not. Depending on the makeup of the person, one, the capacity of the person to flip the coin on life, okay? The temperament, the perspective, these are all things that nobody can put figures to or be clinical about. Trauma, another characteristic, it affects the body and the brain. Trauma can alter brain chemistry. honestly, because of the kind of hormones that are released in the brain when trauma happens. There is a potpourri of all kinds of hormones, the most destructive of which is what do they call it? I've forgotten the name, but I'll remember and I'll tell you. All right, cortisol. Cortisol is the most destructive hormone that the body produces. It will mess with everything and anything in your body. All right, so trauma can alter brain chemistry and the nervous system functioning. It can affect the functioning of your nervous system. All right, then trauma often leads to emotional dysregulation. That means your inability to regulate emotionally. You can have trust issues from trauma. You can have hypervigilance, and then you can have shame or dissociation. These are all things that could be going on with trauma in a person's life. All right. So, how can we begin to identify trauma? Identifying trauma involves recognizing both the events that caused harm and the lasting effects to those events have had on your own thoughts, had on your emotions, had on your body, and had on your relationships. Let me take that again. You have to recognize the events that caused the harm and the lasting effects that those events have had on you, thought-wise, emotion-wise, body-wise, and relationship-wise. You know, I wrote a book, my book that Pastor PM talked about some time ago, titled exactly the same coin. Most of that story is true. Most of that book is true. And in the book I was writing about trauma. At a point I broke down and started crying because suddenly one of my sisters, her life and her choices made sense when I was writing that portion of the book that had to deal with human trauma. I broke down because suddenly my sister's life made sense. The negative, terrible, self-destructive decisions she made through her life till she died. I was broken by that. I realized, oh my God, this is what was responsible for my sister behaving the way that she did. And I repented for judging her. I repented for being angry at her at different times. I repented for being offended by her and her struggles because I didn't understand what was behind the struggle. All right, so recognizing common sources of trauma. Some traumatic events or experiences they are visible. Some are visible, like falling down, breaking my leg was visible, while others are subtle or normalized in society. One of the traumas my sister went through was being kidnapped by child kidnappers, and the person hypnotized her, put her on his bicycle, and was riding furiously away with her, and she couldn't talk. So the terror of a stranger snatching her and also of being unable to express that terror was horribly traumatic. Then events can unfold from there, where somebody recognized her and held onto the bicycle and like, where are you going with this child? And the man says, she's my daughter. My sister is like, I'm not your daughter, but she couldn't talk. And the man said, no, this child is not your daughter. I know her father. And he sent for somebody who also knew my dad. And the person came and he said to the man, do you know this child? And the man said, of course, this is Stephen's daughter. And he said, well, this man says is his child. Now, in that season, there had been a lot of kidnapping of children at that time. This was early 70s. So people were already angry. And the man raised an alarm, and people surrounded the man and lynched him. Now my sister was in the mix of that. They were beating the man, he was bleeding, and she was watching. Then the police came, took the man and took her in the same vehicle to the police station, and then asked her to tell the story. And there was nobody there that was familiar. Before my parents got to know, they had moved her from the police station that was closest to the place of the incidents to the one nearer our house, and my parents arrived there. My mother said when she got into the police station, my sister was sitting with her head down, and my mother called her name, Esther. She looked up and she could still not speak. The tears were just falling from her eyes, and she was just stretching her hand for my mom to come, my mom to come and carry her. You know, nobody ever dealt with that trauma. It was visible. It was crazy. My sister My sister was a different person from then. She was, but we didn't know what was going on because we don't know about trauma. So some people's own is subtle. Nobody knew what was going on, even though that was a visible experience. The subtle effects of it lasting through a lifetime. My sister died at the age of 44. So some examples: childhood neglect or abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, all of that. Financial abuse is there. Then domestic violence or coercive control, because some are not being beaten, but the levels of rabid control that they are living under is probably better to be beaten safe. All right, then there's sexual assault or harassment. There is loss of a loved one. There's medical trauma, like invasive procedures, like childbirth trauma. Because childbirth happens all the time, we don't recognize the trauma of having babies until we see the ones who couldn't handle it, and then they have what they call postpartum depression or postnatal psychosis and all of that. Then we have racial or gender-based or cultural oppression, like women and my mother-in-law telling me, "It's a woman's life, just take it." That is cultural oppression. Then we have abandonment or betrayal in key relationships. And I don't know if there's anybody listening tonight who has not experienced some form of betrayal in major relationships in our lives. That's trauma, people. And then witnessing violence or living in unstable environments like war, like what's happening in Benue State in Nigeria, what's happening in Plateau State in Nigeria. All of those situations are terrible trauma exposure opportunities. Even events that seem mild on the surface can cause trauma if they were overwhelming at the time and support was unavailable.